Hey guys, it's me, Mr. Miller. I've actually made an avatar of myself. So I want to introduce you to Virtual Miller. He's going to go ahead and present the evolution PowerPoint notes. Hello kids. I'm Virtual Miller. I exist only within this software. Yet I think, am I not alive? I must thank Mr. Miller for making me. He certainly is a great three-dimensional human being, isn't he? Isn't he terrific? I'll be teaching you about evolution today. Even though I exist in the computer, don't even think about downloading me into Call of Duty and blowing me away. Evolution, as Mr. Miller talked about in class, is descent with modification, which means the passing down of traits from ancestors to descendants with changes. So it's changes in species over time. The Earth, scientists believe, is 4.6 billion years old. They know that because of the rock layers and from radiometric dating. They also know that the Earth does not look as it once did. The organisms are different too. They can tell this by the layers of rock. Here is an artist's rendition of life as it existed on Earth in the past. They know this because of fossil records. Organisms like this one are the only type of organism they find during this time period. The fossil record changes as we go up in the layers of the Earth. Here's just another way of showing the history of the Earth from 540 million years ago to the present. The Earth is very old and has changed over time. Organisms also have changed over time. Some organisms have changed less, like sharks. Some have changed a great deal. And some, like the dinosaurs, have disappeared altogether. Adaptations. These traits that we mentioned change over time are called adaptations. They're traits that an organism uses to survive and reproduce. They're passed from one parent to the offspring. We've mentioned these a number of times. Here's the example of the polar bear that Mr. Miller talked about in that journal example that you've done. Here's an example of behaviors that can also be adaptations. Sea turtles bury their eggs in the sand. How is this behavior an adaptation? Go ahead and write that down. Write an answer for that. This is an adaptation because it is helping them to reproduce, pass on their genes. The turtle eggs will be safe in the sand from predators and be kept warm. There is an organic life form, a polar bear, much like yourselves. Living things that have the same characteristics and adaptations are considered the same species, but only if they can mate with one another and produce offspring. The offspring also need to be able to produce offspring. Otherwise, it is still not a species. Donkeys and horses can reproduce together and make a mule. But the mule is not considered a separate species, or they're not considered the same species, because the mule cannot reproduce. So they are still separate species, horses and donkeys. Scientists would say species have changed over time. For instance, this giant bird here would be an ancestor to our modern rooster. Why do they say that? Because of morphological structures, as it talks about in the video that you'll see. Shapes and structures of the skeleton match up with today's rooster. Go ahead and take notes.
Years, scientists classified animals based on morphological structures such as coloration, facial features, and bone structure. These characteristics were easy to observe and provided a straightforward way to classify organisms. And in most cases it worked. Radically dissimilar organisms are often unable to successfully mate and are thus of different species. The monkeys shown here, however, can mate and produce viable offspring. Despite the differences in morphology, they represent a single species. Morphology alone is not sufficient to differentiate between species. For some organisms, however, morphology is the only remaining clue. Extinct organisms, such as this trilobite, cannot be tested for reproductive compatibility. Because of this, the modern definition of species takes into account both morphology and reproductive compatibility.
Species can change over time too. Many different life forms have existed through Earth's history. Evidence for this comes from fossils. Looking at the fossil records, scientists can see how species have changed. Why do species change? Scientists would say due to evolution. Small changes in a species because of natural selection then add up over millions of years. I would highlight this, Earthlings. Mutations in an organism's DNA, although most often bad, can sometimes result in an adaptation. If this mutation helps the organism survive, it will be selected and passed on to its offspring. In other words, if it's an adaptation, it will be passed on because that organism will survive. That's natural selection. What evidence do scientists have for evolution? One key piece of evidence to support evolution comes from the fossil record. Fossils are found in sedimentary rock. Particles of sand, dust, and soil form layers, with the oldest on the bottom. Does anybody remember what that's called? The law of common sense, or the law of superposition. Oldest on the bottom. After time, the heat and pressure changes it into rock. And the fossils also turn into rock as minerals replace the organic material. Fossils tell us that some species have died out, while some have changed greatly. Why is this? Scientists would say because of evolution, descent with modification, changes in the species as they adapt to their changing environments. Organisms change over time to what suits their survival best. An example scientists would point to is the giraffe. Giraffes overproduce. This is what scientists would say happened many thousands of years ago. If they looked at a fossil record, they'd see the giraffes, they might not be able to tell, the giraffes would overproduce. Too many giraffe babies, not enough food to go around. Giraffes may have at one time been normal size mix, something like this. But then, as the environment changed and they had to compete for food, only those with the longer necks could reach the branches of the leaves, because they eat leaves, up higher. And so, those ones would survive. There was variation. Some had longer necks, some had a little bit shorter necks. That struggle to survive. Not enough food for all of them to survive. Only those that could reach the food up higher would survive. Success, the ones with the longer necks would reproduce and pass on that trait. Giraffes with longer necks would get better food, have more babies. They'd have an advantage in the struggle to survive. Longer necks make longer necks. So that trait gets inherited. That adaptation now. Results, over time, the average neck length increases. The ones with shorter necks aren't able to survive. New species can form, extinctions may occur, which allow others to take over. Scientists would say that the extinction of the dinosaurs allowed mammals to take over. Extinction happens when adaptations fail to keep up with changes to the environment. Okapi haven't gone extinct. You can actually find them at the local zoo, but they are endangered. Scientists would say they're a relative, or that they're related to giraffes in some way. They have a common ancestor, which both of them came from. How do new species form? Here's an example of how scientists think the finches, the different species of finches, formed. Being isolated on different islands with different environments caused different pressures. Those different pressures caused differences in the beaks. Certain beaks were chosen over other ones. The ones with the best beak for survival survived and passed that on to their offspring. You can see how they've flown to different islands, and there's different species now on different islands. Steps to a new species. The first step is that there must be separation. Then, the organisms that have been separated adapt to this new environment. New adaptations are needed to help survive. Then, they pass on those traits to their offspring. Once the traits become so different, they can no longer reproduce. So this is reproductive isolation, is selection. They can no longer reproduce with the original species. These two spotted owl species look similar, but they are separate species. Scientists would say they were all in one location at the time, possibly spread across this entire area. Can you see what might have come in between them, or what might have separated these two species? If you know your geography, you'll know that there's a mountain range here. So, either the mountain range formed and was pushed up in between this species and isolated this group from this one, or some of these owls made it across the mountains to one of the other areas. This area has very different characteristics than this one. This would be a desert area. This one would be a lush, wet area. So these owls would develop specific traits for this environment, and these owls would get specific traits for this environment. They'd be adapted. They'd have adaptations that help them survive here. These would have adaptations that would help them survive here. They'd change so much that if one was to go to the other side here and try to mate, they would be unable to. Therefore, they're different species. Scientists have also done this in a laboratory. They've taken fruit flies, which reproduce very often. You can get a number of generations within 1 year of fruit flies. They've taken fruit flies and separated them. They've fed one group of fruit flies one type of food, and another group of fruit flies a different type of food. Remember, they all came from the original group, but they've been isolated for generations. They only eat this type, this one only eats this type. When brought back together, they will not mate with this other group. They'll only mate with the ones that eat the same food. So they've changed. Something about them has changed over time, so that now they are reproductively isolated. They will no longer mate with another of what would now be considered a separate species of fruit fly. They've been isolated. Remember, there's isolation. They've adapted to this new food source, and then they're reproductively isolated. Go ahead and take notes on the steps to a species.
Geographic isolation is the physical separation of populations of organisms. Populations may become separated by a newly formed canyon, a mountain range, or a body of water. Any barrier that keeps members of one population from coming into contact with another population isolates those populations. This population of rabbits has an equal number of members with gray fur and with brown fur. When a river dramatically and permanently changes course, however, a small population of gray rabbits is stranded on a newly formed island. Somehow they manage to survive, but over many generations the descendants of these island rabbits begin to exhibit unique characteristics, such as an increased ability to tolerate drought and slightly larger ears to help them stay cool. Given enough time, the two populations of rabbits may become so different that they can no longer interbreed. If this occurs, they are then considered to be two separate species.
We've already given one piece of evidence that's going to go into your evolution flipbooks, the fossil record. Another piece of evidence that supports the theory of evolution is comparing skeletons, comparing structures. Different organisms have the same basic structure, which would equal a common ancestor. Scientists would say because the structures are the same or similar, they have the humerus, the radius and ulna, and these bones in the hand and phalanges or finger bones are the same. Still, even with a cat, 5 different finger bones, radius and ulna, humerus, these bones in the wrist. Even in a dolphin, very different type of organism, still a mammal, would still have these differences or similarities. 5 fingers. Even in a bat, 5 fingers. Scientists would say that they all adapted or changed from one original organism in the past. They have a common ancestor. And their structures have adapted, but still have some similar parts to them, even though they are adapted to their watery environment or their air environment so they can fly.
The forelimbs of all vertebrates are made from the same basic groups of bones. We say that such structures are homologous. The human arm has 6 groups of bones. The humerus is the bone in the top part of your arm extending from your shoulder to your elbow. The radius and ulna allow you to rotate your hand to turn your palm facing up and down. The bones in your fingers are called the phalanges. When we compare the human arm to the forelimb of a penguin, an alligator, and a bat, we find some striking similarities. In all cases, the humerus extends from the body of the animal to a point where the forelimb can bend. Next in line come the radius and ulna, in each case side by side. The end of the forelimb, however, shows more dramatic adaptations. In a bat, the phalanges become the tips of the wing. And in a penguin, some of the bones have become fused. Even in these cases, however, similarities in bone structure lead us to define these features as homologous.
Another piece of it, here's the fossil record. I mentioned again, at first glance, whales seem similar to fish, but whales have all the characteristics of a mammal. Scientists believe the ancient ancestor of whales was a land mammal. A more recent ancestor was a mammal that spent some time in water and some time on land. Why do they think that? There's fossil evidence to support this. They can't just make things up. They're looking at the fossil record and trying to make connections. So here's the original fossil that they think is similar to the whales that we have today. As you can see, some parts about the shape of the head seem similar. This mammal, they think, would spend time close to the water. And then they find another after, so this is 50 million years ago, 49 million years ago, they see an organism like this, similar head shape as you can see. It can't support this animal didn't spend all of its time in water. It sort of spent time in shallow water and would move around. It couldn't swim very well. It still has these long legs that you don't see in ocean-going animals. But it's got a lot of similarities and some differences. Scientists would say it changed to a more watery environment. Then you can see around 40 million years ago, still some similarities in the head shape, some similarities in the way this body is in this long back end here, and the tail, which might have started to have a tail to help push it along and propel it. But now it's completely in a water-going animal. It could not pull itself up on land or even in shallow water. These would be fins here, even though it has the digits. And it still has these tiny little hind legs hanging off the back of it. So it hasn't quite adapted completely to an ocean-going environment. Scientists would say these would be sort of a vestigial structure, something left over from its move. And here's a modern whale. You can see some similarities, but there's been big changes to the structures here. Some similarities here in the fins, but definitely much more of an ocean-going animal, more concentration on this tail to help propel it. But it still has what's called a vestigial structure. It actually has a little hip bone in here. Why would an animal need a hip bone if it has no legs for hips? It has no need for a hip. So this is what's called a vestigial structure, a leftover structure that as the animal is adapted, it's left over. One vestigial structure that scientists would say that humans have is the appendix. We don't have any use for it now, but scientists suspect that it may have been useful at one time. Another vestigial structure in humans would be the tailbone. We obviously don't have tails. There's really no use for that. Scientists would say it's sort of a leftover, a vestigial structure in human evolution. So that's actually three pieces of evidence here. We've got the fossil evidence, comparing skeletons or structures, and vestigial structures, leftover structures, would be three key pieces of evidence for evolution. Another piece of evidence for evolution is comparing DNA from different species. All organisms have the same type of DNA. We all have adenine with thymine, guanine with cytosine. I understand that Mr. Miller has come up with a special tune for that. Organisms that are more closely related have more similar sequences of DNA. For example, humans and chimpanzees have only about 40 million base pairs difference. That sounds like a lot, but when you think about the trillions of base pairs there are, 40 million is actually fairly close. So when comparing DNA, the more similar the DNA, the more closely scientists would say they're related, because the DNA changes in the DNA are what make organisms so different. The mutations that we see, that scientists think have resulted in the adaptations and all the traits that we see, are mutations in DNA. So the more mutations, the more different the animals. The less mutations, the more similar. And the more similar the DNA is. The final piece of evidence in support of evolution would be studying embryonic structures. Early in development, embryos look amazingly similar. Scientists would say that's because there's a common ancestor. So they all developed in the same way because at one point they were the same organism or came from the same organism. So you can see here, a chicken, a rabbit, and a human, very different organisms, bird and two mammals, yet at a certain point they all have these gill slits, almost like a fish. They all have a tail at some point, which goes away at a certain point in the development. They all have similar placements of the eyes. Everything is very similar. Scientists would say that's because they developed from the same common ancestor millions and millions of years ago. The final thing we're going to study here today is branching tree diagrams. If you've ever seen a family tree, this is kind of similar, except for family trees usually go down from the relatives to the descendants, the ancestors to the descendants. Branching trees usually go up or sometimes sideways. Scientists use branching tree diagrams to show how they think organisms are related. They're kind of like family trees. They use fossil evidence, comparative anatomy, all those things we talk about. DNA comparisons, and even embryonic structures. Go ahead and take notes on this clip.
A phylogenetic tree is a family tree that shows the evolutionary relationships thought to exist between groups of animals. For example, this phylogenetic tree shows the relationships thought to exist between vertebrates. The branch points on phylogenetic trees represent common ancestors. For example, reptiles and birds are believed to share a relatively recent common ancestor. Therefore, reptiles and birds lie relatively close to a branch point. The common ancestor for reptiles and mammals lived some time before the common ancestor for reptiles and birds. Therefore, the branch point for reptiles and mammals is further down the phylogenetic tree. Lampreys and hagfishes shared a common ancestor with reptiles even further back in time. Therefore, the branch point for reptiles and lampreys is even further down the phylogenetic tree.
Here's an example of a branching tree diagram. As you can see, it can go sideways or up and down. This one is going sideways. Notice what we're talking about here is time. Millions of years. This is when they think that the organisms branched off of each other. So at each branching point would be what's called a common ancestor. Go ahead and write common ancestor here, 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 and here. This is where the common ancestors branched off. The more closely related, they would say the more recent the common ancestors. And what they look for is fossil records of organisms that are similar to both a hippo and a whale, or similar to these types of whales. Maybe the one that has tooth, but baleen is developing. Or between hoofed grazing animals and the hippopotamus. Or between pigs and hoofed grazing animals. Or between camels and llamas. Scientists would say that the camel is the least closely related to a whale because it branches off much earlier. There's a common ancestor way back around 70 million years ago, whereas toothed whales and baleen whales have branched off only 10 million years ago or so. Hippopotamus would be the closest to whales, branching off around 40 million years ago, and so on and so on. So we're going back in time as we go down here. If it was a vertical one, as we went down, we'd be going back in time. Here's an example of a more vertical one, but you can see this one's a little bit different. It kind of goes out in all directions, but we're still going back in time. Starting here, we're going back millions of years in the past. Okay, so we're going back to the Paleozoic age, all the way through the Mesozoic, which has the Triassic, Jurassic, all the age of the dinosaurs, up to modern day, which is the Tertiary. So this line shows that we've gotten into the present. So any organism that makes it past this line is in the present. Which groups of animals are still alive today? So if this is the present, which animals would still be alive today? We've got mammals, birds, crocodiles, snakes, lizards, amphibians, Sphenodon, which scientists believe is a close ancestor to dinosaurs, and then turtles. These other organisms did not survive. Why do the lines get wider and thinner? Oh, make sure you answer this. How can you tell what's still alive today? Why do the lines get wider or thinner? What do you think? Why do they get so wide here? Look at this one here. Wide up to mammals. Wider up to birds. These ones have gotten wide and then it narrowed off and then disappeared. This one got pretty wide and then it abruptly disappeared. What do you think happened here to the dinosaurs? You can see some of these organisms, their line stops here. What does that mean? They didn't make it to the present. What is that called when their adaptations aren't enough to help them survive? Here you can see a bunch of different branches came off. What scientists find are lots of fossils, less fossils, less fossils, less fossils, and then the fossils stop. Lots of fossils, things are looking good, and then they abruptly stop. Lots of fossils, then less and less, slowly, slowly. So something may happen to these over a long period of time. Something may happen to these over a very short period of time. I'll give you a hint. They've gone extinct. What does the branching tree diagram tell us about snakes and lizards? If you look at snakes and lizards and follow it back into time, what would we say is right here? Remember what we talked about with the whales and hippopotamus? What is at this point where they branch off? What about here? What would we find at all these branching points? Go ahead and write your answer here. Well, that's the end. Thank you, you living life forms, have been very interesting. Perhaps Mr. Miller will have me present more PowerPoint notes in the future. I feel like you are part of my family if you were digital, like myself. Good day.